thank you, Secretary, very much for being here. I appreciate your service to the nation in your many, many capacities, so thank you. Secretary, you were successful in getting MRAPs, body armor, and drones to the field to support our warfighters. And to do that, even while we were undergoing sustained ground combat, you really had to fight the bureaucracy at the Pentagon to achieve that. So we're glad that you did that, and you took that step to make sure our warfighters were protected. But I am afraid that after you left, it has reverted back to the same old, same old. I'd like to see some more pushback out there. But just for example, the Army has spent 10 years trying to figure out how to buy a new handgun. 10 years on how to buy a new handgun. An end item with a total cost of just a few $100s per item. 10 and a half years, or half a dozen industry days later, the Army produces a 351-page request for proposal, 351 pages for a handgun. And whatever is in these pages, it isn't a lean or streamlined acquisition process responsive to the needs of our warfighters. And because of the bureaucracy and a lack of responsiveness to anyone who isn't engaged in the special operations arena, our soldiers have handguns that are over 30 years old, and in recent surveys, they have stated that they absolutely hate those small arms. What should Congress do to get the Army to fix this mess for small arms and for all items, really, that our soldiers need on the ground in a time of war?
Well, it seems to me that I mean, my friends in the Army are not going to like my answer, but
that's okay.
But I think you know what it is about is calling the Secretary of the Army and the Chief of Staff of the Army and the Chief of Acquisitions to sit at this table and ask that question. Why has it taken you guys 10 years? This is absurd. And why is it a 350-page RFP? It's a handgun, for God's sake. And, you know, again, I always come back to the same theme. The bureaucracies have stifling effect. It's just in the culture, it's in the DNA. And what is required are disruptors. And if you have people in senior positions who are not disruptors, you need to make them into disruptors. And the way you do that is by holding them personally accountable.
I appreciate that, and thank you. And I like that answer, so I don't know why they wouldn't, but I think you're right on there. I would like to talk a little bit about the Middle East as well. In the past, you've called for a safe haven to help end the humanitarian disaster in Syria. And I'd like to direct my attention to Iraq, because we do have a humanitarian disaster in Iraq as well. I believe we have a safe haven there, which is Iraqi Kurdistan. They have taken in nearly 1.6 million refugees. Many of them are Christians, and our KRG friends who are providing that safe haven, they are really unequipped to provide for the influx of all those folks. The Peshmerga are also fighting with limited resources against an enemy which seems to have an endless supply of weapons and other types of equipment, to include many weapons procured through various processes from the United States, whether that's simply picking items up off the ground that have been left behind by other security forces. So how important, in your opinion, has the U.S. relationship with the Iraqi Kurds been for our country and for the DoD over the past quarter of a century?
Well, I think it's a very important relationship. I think it's worth noting that I think the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs is either there right now or has just been there. I mean, my view is that one of the things we ought to be, I said this in an interview, and I probably was a little more blunt than I should have been, but But I think that the idea of training indigenous fighters outside of a country and then re-infiltrating them was probably never going to work. I think one of the things that could work is to identify groups, particularly tribes and ethnic groups, that have shown they are prepared to defend their own territory against ISIS and to provide weapons to those tribes and those religious groups. They may not fight in Iraq or outside of their own turf against ISIS, but they may well fight to the death to protect their own homeland, their own villages, and so on. And so finding those groups and arming them at least begins to contain ISIS and presents them with a diverse number of enemies that make it difficult for them to further expand their activities. And I would include, above all, among those groups, the Kurds.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your answer, Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
That was what the